Hi everybody. So we are going to talk about spinal cord and peripheral nervous system today. Do remember that we're not going to go into details in terms of physiology for many of these concepts. So we're just kind of scratching the surface, especially in terms of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So kind of a reminder of what we learned from the central nervous system. Your spinal cord, you have total of 31 pairs of nerves associated with the spinal cord. 8 of these nerves are associated with the cervical region. 12 of them are associated with thoracic. 5 are associated with lumbar. 5 associated with your sacral region, and 1 associated with your coccygeal region. Now, when you look at the anatomy of the spinal nerves, it's very similar to what you learned for the muscles. So remember that when we learn about muscles, we have 3 different types of connective tissue that starts from the internal structures and then work their way out toward the larger structures. So if the connective tissue was wrapped around the individual cells, in this case your neurons, the connective tissue is referred to as endoneuron. Again, endo implies inside, neuron as a connective tissue for nervous system. So this is a delicate, loose connective tissue that is wrapped around the cells, and this is covering the peripheral nervous system neurons on top of what we identified as Schwann cells. If you don't recall what Schwann cells were, these are the cells that create myelin sheath in your peripheral nervous system. And you can see it depicted as this yellow covering that we're basically peeling off. And again, notice that your myelin sheath is still underneath that. Now, when you bundle a group of your neurons or your nerve cells, what you will create is a new structure which we identified as a fascicle. So in this picture, this is our group of neurons that are bundled together called fascicles. And this connective tissue that's been peeling off, that's referred to as the perineuron. Again, reminder, peri means around, so perineuron is a connective tissue that is securing a bundle of individual neurons. Finally, what you have is the whole nervous structure. So you have multiple fascicles. In this case, for instance, they're depicting 4. It also includes the main blood vessels that are supplying these neurons. And when you bundle all of them together, you form your actual nerve, which is going to be a visible structure. So these are now macroscopic structure. And the connective tissue that is wrapped around the nerve, which is, again, you can see it as being peeled off right here, that would be known as epineuron. Again, epi implies on top of. So a couple of other notes for this information, or for this page. We have something called neurolemma. Again, neuro imply your nervous system. So neurolemma would be the plasma membrane that is found around your neurons. And again, that if you're talking about the axon portion of that, that is still wrapped with myelin sheath. Now, if you look at the spinal cord, which is connected directly into your peripheral nervous system, whether it be sensory or motor, as we'll see later on, you will have a very similar concept as we discussed for the central nervous system, in the sense that it will still contain gray matter and it will still contain white matter. Again, reminder, gray matter was the non-myelinated axons and the cell body of neurons, versus white matter would be the myelinated axons of the same neurons. Now, if you look at the white matter and gray matter of the spinal cord, they actually create this kind of a butterfly structure. The gray matter would be this kind of butterfly structure right at the center of the white matter within the spinal cord. So let's try to identify this. So I'm going to look at the picture. If you guys go back to the 2 previous slides, you have the information that I'm depicting on the image right here. So first thing that you want to do when you look at the spinal cord, cross-section of the spinal cord, is to identify the anterior and posterior aspect of the spinal cord. And the best way to do so is to look for a fissure versus a sulcus. So notice right here, you have a very deep opening. Again, deep opening in this case, or a deep sulcus would be referred to as the fissure. And if it's not as deep, and then you can see it, it's just appears more of a line than a gap, that's known as the sulcus. So the fissure will always be marking the anterior or ventral aspect, versus the sulcus is always going to mark the posterior aspect. So when you're looking at this, I already identified front and back, so anterior median fissure and posterior median sulcus. Now all I'm going to do is we're going to repeat the same vocabulary for the three sections of both gray matter and the white matter. So right here, this is one section, this is the other section, and this is the third section. So this one in front is called the anterior gray horn or anterior horn. The one on the side is called the lateral gray horn or lateral horn. And the one that we identified as posterior will be posterior gray horn. Now the white matter in this case will be identified as columns. So what we have is an area in the back right here. So that's your posterior white column. The one on the side, which would be your lateral white column or column, and the one you have in front, which is identified as ventral or anterior white column. Now, like everything else we discussed, the spinal cord also has two sides, right and left. So the gray matter of these two hemispheres, if you want to say, needs to be connected together. So the point of connection for that would be called the gray commissure. So basically this region right at the center would be your gray commissure. Notice running at the center of the gray commissure, you have a hole which extends through the spinal cord, and this opening is referred to as the central canal. Kind of for those who may have forgotten, central canal is the space where your cerebrospinal fluid runs at the continuation of your fourth ventricle of the brain. Looking at the side of the spinal cord, basically coming off on the lateral aspect of the spinal cord, you have smaller branches that directly come off of the spinal cord called rootlets. Again, you can say these are anterior or ventral rootlets, and the one on the back would be your posterior rootlets. The rootlets give rise to your roots. So this region right here and this region right here would be your roots. You have an area called the dorsal root ganglion. So right here, I'm sorry, I'm using the same color, but I'm kind of hoping you guys are following me on the PowerPoint. So dorsal root ganglion is the region where we have the cell bodies of the neurons located. And because you have so many cell bodies kind of clustering together, you form an actual structure. Now, in this picture, we have not depicted the continuation of the spinal nerves. If you continue the structure coming off of the spinal cord, you will have two branches, one going this way, one going this way. This branch that is coming to the front would be referred to as the ventral ramus, and the branch that is on the posterior aspect is referred to as dorsal ramus. And you'll see that momentarily what those words actually mean and what the function of these structures are. Here's another picture of the actual spinal cord cross section. Again, best way to identify, again, look at this opening. This is a wide opening versus the line that is almost invisible. This will become your fissure, marking the anterior, and this becomes your sulcus, marking the posterior. Again, you can see the butterfly very clearly in this picture. Now, we mentioned roots and ramus, or rami if we're talking about multiple. So what is the difference between them? Again, I'm going to show you this on a picture because it makes it a little bit easier to follow. So remember when we talked about the introduction of the nervous system, we said that you have three different functional classifications of neurons. Neurons that are identified as sensory that come in, your neurons that are coming out of the central nervous system called motor neurons, or efferent, and the neurons that are located in between them called interneurons. So this picture is kind of depicting the same concept. Again, what you see in blue will be data coming in, same color coding as you have seen in your previous PowerPoints. Red color would be data getting out. And in between them, what you see in gray would be depicting your interneurons, neurons that sits completely within your central nervous system. Now in this picture, again, the areas that are medial to your spinal cord are identified as roots, and the farther away or more lateral you go, they are identifying as rami, which are basically dorsal and ventral. So what is the difference between these? So when you talk about the roots, dorsal and ventral, dorsal roots are strictly sensory. As you can see, the only color you can see in this picture is blue, which means these are sensory neurons that are coming in. Doesn't matter what part of the body these sensory neurons are coming from, front or back, the only way a sensory neuron can come into your central nervous system is through dorsal root, as in it's coming from the back. Now, what we identify as ventral root based on the coloring, again, notice the coloring is red, which means these are going to be motor neurons. Again, our focus is not, does this motor neuron going to the front or back of the body as an anterior or posterior? Our focus is that if this signal is a motor signal, then it's going to come through your ventral root. Now, let's go ahead and follow the ventral root. When ventral root comes out, notice that it has two options when it comes to rami. It can go to the back of the body through the dorsal ramus, or it can go through the front of the body through the ventral ramus. So at this point, when we're talking about ramus goal is not to look at if the data is sensory or motor. Rather, it looks, does this data need to go to the back, or is it being collected from the back? Or is the data being collected or sent to the front? So for ramus, either ventral or dorsal, our goal is the location within the body rather than the sensory or motor aspect of it. As you can see in the dorsal ramus, you have both color, same thing in your ventral ramus. So what does that mean? If data is motor, and it's associated with the back, it's going to go through the dorsal ramus, but it only can come out from the ventral root. If, let's say, the data is sensory coming from the front, sensory from the front is going to be collected through the ventral ramus, but when it's going directly into the spinal cord, the only path it's going to take is through the dorsal root. So the main concept I want you to really focus on is understanding that dorsal and ventral roots are strictly sensory and motor respectively. And the dorsal ramus and ventral ramus really not focusing on if you're sensory or motor, rather, are you going to the front or back? Or are you associated with front or back? It doesn't matter if you're sensory or motor. So moving on, when we look at the nerve system or nerve fibers that are located within your peripheral nervous system, you do have the ability to regenerate some of the neurons depending on the damage. So first note that if the damage is to the cell body, which is where you have your nucleus and all of the organelles, that neuron chance of survival is pretty slim. Neuron will die, and because that neuron loses the ability to communicate with its neighboring neurons, sometimes the neighboring neurons also die. Now, if the damage is not to the cell body and rather it's to the axon, so the cell body remains intact, there is a possibility to regenerate the neuron and have the neuron gain its full capacity. So what are the steps involved in fixing a neuron? The first one is basically you start with axon being fragmented. So axons start to seal itself. Again, if you don't seal your neuron, the damage or the external environment can enter the neuron and basically cause major imbalances in terms of ion and gradients, and that itself will kill the neuron. So axon needs to seal itself to protect the rest of the cell. Now, whatever that is not receiving any nutrients and oxygen from the source, those parts of the neuron will start to destroy or get destroyed and degraded. The next step is that macrophages, which are identified as a group of white blood cells, come in and clean up anything that was destroyed as a result of lack of oxygen and nutrients. Now, this is a main step, step 3, growth of an axon through a regeneration tube. So at this point, you have your Schwann cells, which are forming your myelin sheath, move to the site of the damage. And these cells start to release what we identified as growth factors. These are extremely important for neuron regeneration. What they start to create is a tube that is near the damaged axon. And that tube is essential for allowing the cell body to recreate a new axon and develop it through that neural tube. Now, eventually, the axon is fully generated, and the Schwann cells that have come to the site will form a myelin sheath around the axon and creating a new level of insulation. Again, you can kind of depict it in this picture. You start with the neuron basically being damaged. So let's say the damage is within this area as depicted here. Neuron's going to seal itself right here. The macrophages are coming and destroying the basically disintegrated part of the axon. You see the formation of the growth tube right here around this. And then finally, you form your myelin sheath around the axon and form a healthy nerve fiber, very similar to what we started with. Now, before I move on, please do note that this regeneration is not as easy in central nervous system. Therefore, if neurons on the brain or your spinal cord are damaged, the chance of recovery and regeneration of those neurons are slim to none. Now, nervous system organization. So we are shifting gears from peripheral nervous system to more specific branching of the peripheral nervous system known as autonomic. Again, if you guys don't remember the branching, please go back and review your introduction to nervous system PowerPoint. To kind of go over that quickly, you have two main branches of the peripheral nervous system, sensory and motor. Motor branches based on voluntary or involuntary actions to somatic and autonomic, respectively. Autonomic then branches into sympathetic and parasympathetic, which basically known as fight or flight or rest and digest, respectively. So the main divisions of autonomic, as is described here, is sympathetic or fight or flight response, and parasympathetic, which is rest and digest or housekeeping. Now here's a depiction of parasympathetic. Again, rest and digest. parasympathetic activity is dominating the typical nervous system versus fight or flight. Your sympathetic activity are going to dominate. Kind of super relaxed versus under stress. Now, we're not going to go into details about the neurotransmitter, the ganglion, the receptors that interact with each of these. That's beyond the scope of this class. This is an anatomy class. You will get a high dosage of that during physiology. What I do want you guys to know is understand the nerves that are involved in the parasympathetic and sympathetic activities. So what you will see on the parasympathetic is depicted in purple, and your sympathetic branch are depicted in green. So if an exam question asks you, by looking at this picture, where would you have, or what neurons, what spinal nerves are associated with the sympathetic branch of autonomic nervous system, your answer should be thoracic region or thoracic nerves and lumbar L1 and L2, which basically means lumbar spinal nerves located in lumbar L1 and L2. If the question was asking you what are the nerves that are involved in the parasympathetic process, you actually have both cranial nerves and spinal nerves involved. So cranial nerves that are involved is your nerve number 7, cranial nerve number 9, and cranial nerve number 10. So do you need to know what activity they do? What part of the body they target? Again, not for this class. You will learn more about this in physiology. And the second set of nerves that are involved in parasympathetics are your sacral nerve 2, 3, and 4. So be conscious of the nerves, the locations. Know that the cranial and spinal nerves are involved in parasympathetic, and then thoracic and lumbar nerves are associated with sympathetic branching. Now, again, this is a really brief overview of the differences you will observe when your fight or flight response kicked in versus when you have your rest and digest system active. So sympathetic, typically what you see is you have an increase in heart rate. On top of that, you also have increase, and you can add that yourself, you also have increase in the contractile force of your heart. So basically your heart not only beats more frequently, but with a stronger contraction to push more blood out. You also would see a relaxed air passageway, which allows an easier and a more fluid movement of air through your air passageway. You also notice that through the activity of your iris muscles, you have pupil dilation, which creates a better vision, basically makes you more aware of your environment. At this point, if you have sympathetic division active, you really don't focus on digesting your food. So any activity associated with your digestive system typically slows down. That includes the muscle movement that moves the food through the intestines and the stomach. It also involves the secretion of digestive enzyme that also slows down the process. Now, most typically, you have an increased blood flow to certain skeletal muscles that will help you deal with the fight or flight response. Now, typically, what you will see parasympathetic is not 100% opposite, but very close to being opposite of what you see for sympathetic. So typically, you see a decrease in heart rate with not much effect on the contractility of the heart. Air passageway are typically more narrow because your body doesn't need to move as much air. Pupils are typically constricted because, again, you want to limit how much air is getting into your light, getting into your eyes, basically. Kind of imagine if you're digesting your food, you don't want a lot of light. If you're in a food coma, you don't want to be in a bright environment. You want to be relaxing, right? Zooming into objects that are close to your eyes, etc. So your focus is again limiting the amount of light coming into your eyes, using your iris muscle to adjust pupil size. And then your focus at this point would be the digestive system. So you will have more motility in terms of smooth muscles of the intestine and the stomach. Food effectively move through it. You also have an increase in terms of secretion of digestive enzyme to help you process your food. Last concept we're going to talk about is nerve plexus. Spinal nerves that, or again, we learned there are 31 pairs of nerves. When they form your ventral rami, they form this interlacing network with branching, basically creating this kind of braiding patterns throughout the four structure of cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. This allows the nerves to create redundancy. So in case there is damage to one nerve, you still will have movement or sensory data from the same area. And again, as it says, there are four branching, the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. Now, again, we're not going to show a lot more detail than what I have on the PowerPoint. I have gone ahead and pointed this picture for you that kind of shows the complexity of your brachial plexus. You notice that there again, there's a lot of interlacing patterns where the nerves creating redundancy. What I do want you guys to know for brachial plexus is some of the main nerves that originates from this plexus. One is referred to as the axillary nerve, which you can see right here. This nerve is essential for innervating the posterior of the arm and the forearm, which is your extensors. You have, my mistake. Axillary nerve innervates your deltoid and your teres minor, which are basically in your shoulder area. Radial nerve, kind of think about where your radius is. They're focused more on the posterior of the arm and your forearm, more specifically your extensors. Ulnar nerve, which runs more on the lateral aspect of the arm, are focused on the anterior of the forearm and your palm and digit number 4 and 5. And the median nerve, which runs in the middle of the forearm, are involved in flexor muscles, basically the muscles that cause flexions of your forearm. Now, there are two typical conditions that are listed here in terms of damages to the brachial plexus. One is what we identified as the claw hand, what you see on the right-hand side. And this is when you have damage to your ulnar nerve and you lose the capacity to extend your interphalangeal joint. So your hand basically stay in this position, literally like a claw. And hand of benediction, which is damage to the median nerve. And this is your inability to bend your fingers 1, 2, and 3, which basically means your thumb all the way to your middle finger. So your thumb, your index finger, and your middle finger are unable to flex, so you can bend them. You only can bend number 4 and 5. The other nerves plexus that we have is your cervical plexus. Again, cervical associated with your neck. The main nerve that is extremely important for this region is a phrenic nerve that is innervating the diaphragm. And again, recall that diaphragm is important in terms of breathing, as it's where your lungs are connected to for expansion of your lung during inhalation. For your sacral plexus, the most important nerve you probably have all heard of, called sciatic nerve. Sciatic nerve is the thickest and longest nerve in the body and literally innervates from the hip all the way to the foot. And it's extremely important. Usually I say if you have problems with your legs, there is a really good chance that the issue is associated with sciatic nerve. And the lumbar plexus, one of the main nerves you have, is femoral nerve. Again, the name of the nerve kind of implies in terms of location. This nerve is important by providing innervation for more anterior aspect of the thigh. If you recall the name of your muscles, you have 4 main muscles here, which are called your quadriceps muscles. And you also partially innervate your legs and all the way down to your knee and foot. Please do note that even though I'm only mentioning one main nerves within each of these plexus, that there are definitely other nerves that are also extremely important for the functionality of the data collection and sensory. So do not dismiss them, but again, there is main ones that I have highlighted for you here. So that is about it for our nervous system lecture. We shall continue our content with special senses, where we would review your eyes and ears as your 2 main senses in our future lecture.